Okay, so disclaimer, I do not work in the foundry industry and I'm not an expert on foundries. I am an environmental scientist and this is the study I want to talk to you about. Also, isn't it so refreshing that a woman is up here? Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a bit about what we've been working on for the last 2 years related to the environmental aspects of the foundry industry. Peter, who's just presented before me, is also kind of part of this overall project, and he's focusing specifically on energy. So, in October 2019, the NFTN asked the CSIR Environmental Management Services Group to do a status quo assessment of the foundry industry in South Africa. So, we went out. The purpose, first of all, of that status quo assessment in 2019 was just to find out, what is happening in the foundry industry, how many foundries are currently operational, how many people are employed, just the general status of the foundry industry. And the specific tasks that we needed to do was to come up with that inventory of the number of foundries. We wanted to also talk about, the operational status of the foundries since the last survey. And then we asked a bunch of different questions around the tonnage produced, the number of people employed, whether they were male or female. So it was just an overall, really, a status quo assessment of the foundry industry. So based on our this feedback, okay. So based on our status quo assessment for 2019, that's just the geographical location of the foundries that we surveyed. During the status quo assessment. So obviously, as we all know, that the majority of the foundries are based in Gauteng, and then there's quite a few in KZN and also in the Western Cape. So the methods we used for that status quo assessment study was a questionnaire, much like this current one. And as part of the questionnaire, we physically went to all the foundries that we had on our database. So we visited 80 foundries in the space of about 2 months, and that was right before the lockdown period hit. And based on the submissions and our interviews with the different foundry members, we then wrote up a report and we did some analysis. And then we wrote up a draft report, and then we did a final report, which we then presented to relevant foundry industry players. And that was in July 2020. So just briefly, the key findings from that status quo report, that the original database we had was 134 foundries, and we ended up with 123 that were operational in 2020. So I know Isidore's talk earlier said when you talk about the number of foundries, everyone, you can fight about it. So this is based on our study. There are probably other versions or other numbers of the number of operational foundries there are. And then that, if you just have a look at that, just the types of foundries, the classification, types of furnaces, the tonnage produced. We did an average of the annual turnovers for the different foundries that we had. And then we also looked at the employment status in those specific foundries. So there were 57 completed survey questionnaires, which we received. And then in total, we actually went to 80. We did face-to-face with 80 of those. So I think the response rate was really great, and the data we collected was really rich. So we wanted to build on that with the phase 2 study. Summary of the key challenges, which I'm sure all of you know. Number 1 was the supply of energy. 2 was just the consumption and the cost of the energy. Quite a number of the foundries were, made it known to us that just the agreements that they have with the relative local municipalities were just not working out for them. Number 3, which is what we're here to talk about, was the cost of atmospheric emissions licensing. not only the cost to do the initial measurements, but the cost of the annual reporting was something that they really struggled with. And linked to that was obviously the fines that are associated with operating without an atmospheric emissions license. So, I mean, you'll go through that once you have a look at the presentation. I'm really keen to hear the next presenter. That's why I'm whizzing through my presentation. Okay, so then off of the basis of that phase one status quo assessment, we said, okay, it's time for phase two, where we look deeper into not just the overall status quo assessment, but specifically the issue around atmospheric emissions licensing. So what do we want to do with this current phase two compliance action plan? We want like a high level description of, the atmospheric emissions from these different foundries. We want to have discussions with DFFE around potential legislative changes for the amount of monitoring the foundries do. And then we also want to have separate discussions with the local authorities about the fine reductions for those foundries who currently have fines. Just to give you some background in terms of the admin fines for atmospheric licenses, in terms of the Air Quality Act, Section 22A. For operating illegally, you could be fined up to 200K. And then each year, if the facility has operated without an emissions license, it's obviously up to 200K a year. And then if you're operating without an emissions license in a declared air priority zone, I'll show you where those are now, the amount of fine that you could get is around, or it can go up to 1 million rand. So that's just a map of where South Africa's declared air priority areas are. And that's also then a map overlaying some of the foundries' location. And you can obviously see just pointer. Yeah. So around, you know, the around here in this, there's quite a few of the foundries that are concentrated in an air priority area. And like we said in the previous slide, if you're in an air priority area and you're operating without an emissions license, your fines could be pretty high. So it's really important that you comply with that regulation. In terms of the findings of where foundries are in terms of the AELs, there are 38 out of the 57 responses that we got that have AELs, and 22 provided copies of the AELs to us. So Gauteng obviously has the highest number of foundries, and also by default has the number of foundries with AELs that have been issued. So there's also generally a definite requirement for ferrous and most non-ferrous foundries to have AELs. And those are just some other stats around environmental issues. So, if a foundry was established before 1997, they don't need an EIA. If it's after 1997, they would need an environmental impact assessment if they are operating or have listed activities that fall under NEMA. So now we're in phase two, and the methodology is much the same, only that COVID hit and we couldn't physically go to the different foundries to source the data. Hence the struggle to get the online survey. We did an online survey, which we've got feedback that we need to simplify. And then also, I think with the relaxation of some of the regulations that had stopped us from going out, if the people that we want to meet are comfortable, we want to go back onto the road to try and get this data from the foundries because it's really important. Yeah, so like I said, the key data sources are just that online survey that we have. And then we've also been trying to get actual data from the South African Atmospheric Emissions License and Inventory Portal, where foundries upload their annual emissions reports. That would be the easiest route, but it's proving very difficult to get access to that data. I'm not even going to go into any preliminary studies because we've only got 10% of the responses, but it's important to note that we're actually building on from the 57 slash 80 interviews we did on the first phase report. So, I mean, the survey is ongoing. These results I just wanted to show you because they're not much deviation from the previous status quo assessment. So, what's the way forward? What are we hoping to get out of this? We're hoping to get a summary report that shows us all the foundries that are definitely compliant with NEMA EIA regulations, the foundries that are not, the foundries that are currently in the process, the same with the AELs. But most importantly, what we want to get is the actual emissions data. Why do we want to get this? So in order to initiate a policy change. So as we all know, foundries need to annually report their emissions data to DFFE. They need to hire consultants to do this reporting for them, and it can be quite expensive. So if we want to go to the Air Quality Act has specific thresholds for the NOxes and SOxes that foundries cannot exceed. If we want to go to DFFE and say, based on actual reported data from the foundries, they are well below these specific thresholds that are in the legislation. Therefore, can you amend the legislation so that foundries don't have to either one, annually report the data, and you can just negotiate how often you want the reporting to be. And then if it's a new foundry, they wouldn't need to actually do the atmospheric licensing because they would be below the specified thresholds in the legislation. So just in terms of the key outcomes of the study, just to confirm if the foundries are undergoing that Section 22A for the AEL licensing or a Section 24G for NEMA, that's around the EIA and rectification processes. And then we also want to negotiate with the local authorities around the reduction of fines for the atmospheric emission licensing. And then, like I said, we need the data to actually go to DFFE to talk about the Air Quality Act listed activities, not to apply to all ferrous foundries, but rather to include an informed throughput threshold. And then also I've already mentioned around, we need a consultation record with the AEL authorities in the key municipalities with the foundries. Thank you.